Okay, so 3.4, we're talking about adolescence. So again, we're working through the timeline of kind of the human existence. So for adolescence, we're going to be looking again at physical, cognitive, and social development, as well as focusing a bit on the moral development. And this is one that should be pretty applicable as this is you all currently. So what is adolescence, right? In psychology, we talk about this as this transition period from childhood into adulthood. And of course, this, like a lot of things in psychology, is very influenced by culture and by when this time comes. So, like, you can see this graph up in the upper right, 1890 versus 1990. By 1890, like, most women were married by like early 20s. By now, it's like late 20s. Like way more people go to college. Way more people are much more likely to live with their parents. You can stay on your parents' insurance until 26. Like, there's all of these things that now keep it toward this adulthood. In this emerging stage, emerging adulthood is much more extended, right? It's no longer something that you're phasing out of in your teens. It's now really happening in your mid to late 20s. So, adolescence is this period from puberty into kind of full, more like adulthood and independence. So, um, physical side of development, right? So you've got two things going on, right? So physically, one, you have puberty, this overactive limbic system, hormonal surge, very impulsive, risky, thrill seeking, lots of emotional responses. So you have that paired with, if you're looking specifically at the brain, this is a pruning phase. So recall those like neural development or neural connections and networks that you had built over the early stages of your life, right? Like after your toddler years up until kind of your early teenage years, you were building these new neural networks that when you're in your teenage years, your brain is kind of cleaning those out. Right, your brain is cleaning those out and building new neural networks. It's making space for your final like surge into adulthood, and so pair those things together, right? Your brain losing neural networks and an overactive limbic system, and you have teenagers. So what's happening here along this time in the brain as well, you're continuing to get more and more myelinated. So remember, for women, myelination is finished by around 21 to 24. For men, myelination continues until about 27 to 30. That's why oftentimes they're like, girls are just in generally more mature than boys, but to some extent there is some evidence to that, as myelination is it gives us the ability to like control our impulses, and it just men continue to develop that and aren't fully complete in their myelination until their late 20s, whereas women are finished with that at a much younger age. Cognitively, we're now looking into, this is the final stage of cognitive development in the Piaget model. We're moving now into that formal operational stage where you're now developing the ability to reason, right? You're now really thinking through, you're planning for the future, you're thinking long term. You're really beginning to develop the kind of a morality of sense, right? You can really weigh different options and think about stuff longer than just the very moment. You're still often thinking about things from your own perspective, right, in the early stages of adolescence, but you still have the ability to think abstractly, if that makes sense, right? Like for you all, and this is, I remember being the exact same way. Everyone thinks that they are this like incredible, one of a kind, unique, having all of these experiences, and it's like no one else would understand. But like most people would understand, right? Like most experiences are not actually that unique, but in this period, between lack of myelination, between the pruning phase, puberty, limbic system, all of that, it causes adolescents to see everything as very like self-focused, and kind of be very emotional, and that's natural, right? It's not anything to look down upon or think that someone is wrong for that. It's a very natural path for adolescence. So this moral development that we talked about, this is also where Kohlberg believes you are moving into this post-conventional morality. Remember, pre-conventional and conventional, kind of following the rules because you want to avoid punishment or gain rewards, or just following the rules because you want to maintain the order and keep in line and stuff like that. And then he believes, and this is a stage where people really start to understand basic rights. They start to have more of an ideological framework to understand the world through. And that's oftentimes what people are building for themselves in this adolescent phase. Right? They're really starting to understand that there are ethical things that, like, just laws aren't always right? That sometimes we have to challenge things, and we shouldn't just blindly always listen to authority. Other moral issues within adolescence. They begin Teenagers begin really to develop empathy in a way that younger kids wouldn't. Right, like you can say, like, oh, they're so sweet and they're nice, but like children are inherently very egocentric. So even, yes, when they're very sweet and kind, it's because they've been trained to do that, or because they want to do that. It's not so much a like, I'm doing this like purely because I actually am thinking from that perspective. Remember, they don't have the ability to actually consider someone else's perspective in those early stages of cognitive development. But in adolescence, now really are gaining that compassion and empathy, hopefully. Cognitively, we're also developing in that prefrontal cortex the ability to delay gratification, right? The classic marshmallow test for children, where you laid out a big juicy marshmallow and be like, I'm going to come back in 10 minutes. And if you didn't eat that, I'll give you 2 marshmallows, or I'll give you a couple marshmallows. And most kids failed. But as you get older, kids get better at this. And by adolescence, people are much more able to delay gratification because of that prefrontal cortex development. Interestingly enough, they did long-term studies analysis on the kids who were able to or unable to control their impulses when they were like 6 in the marshmallow test, and they found that the people that were able to control their impulses also scored higher in their teenage years and in their adult years as more socially responsible. They were more successful. They were more productive. Which is fascinating thinking about. So usually what they found as well was that those kids, the reason they were successful was because they didn't just sit there and stare at the marshmallow. The kids that were able to pass basically either like hid the marshmallow, they were smart enough to put it away, or they like got up and walked around, or they sang songs, like did something to distract themselves. So we can definitely take a lesson from that when it comes to the marshmallow of our times, our cell phones. Socially, the adolescent stage, right, dating and romantic relationships, yada, yada, yada. None of this stuff really should be anything too crazy that you all are understanding as you're going through all of these currently. Erickson, yeah, so social development in the adolescence, right? So we're moving into this new phase, identity versus role confusion, where, again, with an active limbic system and puberty happening at the same time, there's all of these new hormonal shifts and changes, and so there's all of these things happening at one time. And on top of that, Erickson claims that it's pretty understandable. This is when people are going through this identity versus role confusion. So people are oftentimes fighting within themselves, right? Again, because you're going through this pruning phase. Are you going to fall in line and adopt your parents' values, expectations of what like society and your teachers and your parents want you to be, or are you going to fight back against that? Right? How are you going to identify? This is both individually and then like trying to find your place in society and where you fall in that line. And again, it's kind of natural to push back against that, and that's this conflict of the adolescence phase. So in this phase, a couple important relationships, primarily parent and peer relationships. Parent relationship in this phase, conflict is normal. Positive parent relationships correlate pretty closely with positive peer relationships, right? Like when people get along with their parents, they tend to have very stable peer relationships as well. The more influence parents have over their child, and this of course makes sense, peer influence is actually less, and then vice versa. So as parents influence the way that their children act, or try to control the way their children act, less peers influence them more. So it's the finding there is that parents, someone will be ultimately influencing you, right? If it's not your parents, it's going to be peers. And what they have also found in psych is that parent influences are most significant at the outer extreme. So the most active parents have a really big influence, and then the least active parents. In the middle, and the kind of more balanced phases, there's this balance between parents and peer influence. So peer relationships, these are also have been studied a decent amount by psych, and recognize their correlations with higher levels of self-esteem. And when you're going through adolescence, it changes what this looks like. So in your early teen years, right, like think middle school, early high school, most people have their like tight main group. They're mostly pretty gender normed, right? They're like very they're very tight, and either this is the boy group, this is the girl group. And the big idea that's, and I think we can all remember from middle school, is conformity, right? It's like, this is who we are. Everybody's kind of like ostracized if they don't act the same. But as you're going through the middle teen years, middle to later high school, more mixed gender groups, people begin to kind of break off and form into relationships. They're much more tolerant of differences. And then your late teen years and like senior year through really going off to college, the focus turns more to intimate relationships. So much more having like one or two really close friends or romantic relationships. And then other interesting kind of a cross section with social psychology. And the importance of recognizing that like a lot of these social stages, as we've said, have been studied primarily by white guys, and they've been studying mostly white teens or white youth. And when they took a look, they kind of broadened the scope, or they looked specifically at minority teens, and they found that their experiences were a little bit different in these stages, and they place a lot more value in these peer relationships, especially in their peer groups for acceptance, right? Like how much more important that is when they are in a majority culture. So finally, the last, we talked about this a little bit in class, but also kind of challenging the norms of Kohlberg and cognitive and moral development. Carol Gilligan points out that like you can't just study white young boys and say that the rules of morality are the same for everyone. She extended that to look at to do a more gender based study, recognizing that women's and female moral development is not quite the same. It's much more care based, whereas men is much more justice based. So for women, it's very based on relationships and responsibility and helping others, whereas men tend much more towards fairness and justice first, and not so much helping someone else. So that's that. It shouldn't be a lot of really uh, new material, right? Like these are all things you probably knew already, and psychology just is just kind of confirming for you. As a whole, this is probably one that you should just get the big ideas on and take away the vocab. So I will see y'all in class.